Good morning, everyone. So it's the second lecture devoted to the symbolic function, that is the second break in the history of a symbol. I told you about yesterday. So the first break was the break between the rhetorical and aesthetic meaning of the symbol, and we ended up with Hegel. And today we're going to approach the second break, which is the break from the symbol to the symbolic function in Lévi-Strauss first today and Lacan tomorrow. So my first point will be about this transition, the transition from symbol to the symbolic function. The symbolic function is a term coined by Lévi-Strauss. So you remember that the word symbol, according to its etymology, means first a sign that represents a thing in its absence, and the convention or contract that binds several subjects together, the alliance, the contract. We said yesterday that the symbol, contrarily to the linguistic sign, was supposed to be necessary and not arbitrary. The link between the signifier and the signified is supposed to be natural or necessary in the symbol, whether it is arbitrary in the sign. But we saw with Hegel that Hegel was deconstructing this opposition, that showing that if symbols are closed on themselves, then we don't have any means to distinguish them from any other linguistic signs. And after all, if we think of certain symbols, like the red flower for socialism, for example, or the green, the color green for hope, we see that the natural link does not exist. We understand the link between the scale and justice, but for example, the red flower and communism or socialism is arbitrary, and we can also think of mathematics. We talk about mathematical symbols, and these symbols are perfectly arbitrary as well. So the link, the distinction between natural and arbitrary is disappearing when we deepen our analysis of the symbol. And as we saw yesterday, once again, Hegel says then it is the end of the symbol, the end of the symbolic, and the beginning of the philosophical. But another trend that became very powerful in anthropology, ethnography, and social sciences in general appeared in the first half of the 20th century, which is structuralism. You all know about this movement. A movement which, on the contrary, instead of seeing the extinction of the symbol in its becoming arbitrary, on the contrary, sees a certain kind of revival, strong revival of the term symbolic. So this is the passage from the symbol to the symbolic. Yes, there is something arbitrary in all contracts. This is the symbolic function, Lévi-Strauss was said. And precisely this arbitrariness of the symbol is what marks the force of the symbol and not its disappearance. So what is it? We said yesterday that the symbol also meant the contract. And if we read Aristotle Politics, book 3, we find that a symbol is a commercial relation, an agreement, a contract. Lévi-Strauss says, then, if all symbols are both arbitrary and contractual, then we might think that all conventions, all human conventions, that is, all kinds of alliances, are both arbitrary, because we cannot justify them, and binding. And binding because arbitrary. Okay? It is not because the symbol is necessary that it binds us together. On the contrary, we all obey two arbitrary rules, arbitrary contracts, the first one being language itself. Okay? We didn't choose, in the beginning, our linguistic community. We received language at birth. It is very constraining, constricting. Barthes, again, talks about the prison of language. So this is something that falls on us at birth. It binds us binds us together in the community, and at the same time it is perfectly arbitrary. So structuralism, first of all, is an inquiry about this paradoxical nature of all human cultures. Anthropology is about culture. What is a culture? Precisely, culture, as opposed to nature, is a realm of conventions that have no explanations. Okay? It is a series of laws, like language, for example, but as we will see in Lévi-Strauss, marriage, kinship, economy, exchange, a series of rules, of laws that binds people together, that fashion a culture, but that have no reason, perfectly arbitrary. So then, Lévi-Strauss will transform the notion of symbol into the symbolic, or the symbolic function, meaning that the symbol is not only one convention, but the symbolic will become, in Lévi-Strauss, the source of all convention. So when we say the symbolic, for example, when we transform the symbolic from adjective to substantive, we say the symbolic, it means the source of all conventions together, be they linguistic, once again, family, kinship, or even political law, etc. Everything that binds us together. Then the symbolic will define the link between subjects who recognize each other as committed to each other in an alliance, a convention, a law. So it is the mutual recognition of all belonging to the same community that transforms the arbitrariness of the symbol into its necessity. So we'll see that this element is central for Lévi-Strauss and for Lacan. What is this? What is a convention? What is a contract? It's very difficult to define it because precisely it is arbitrary. So how can we differentiate a natural law from a symbolic law, from a political law or rule or convention? Lévi-Strauss says there's only one thing, one characteristic of the symbolic as opposed to the natural. The law of the symbolic is that it has to enhance an exchange. The law of the symbolic is circulation and exchange. When we speak, and Lévi-Strauss has read a lot of linguistics, when we speak, what do? We constantly exchange words. In one sentence, we use different words, we make that exchange. When we communicate, we exchange. Lévi-Strauss says at the basis of all human conventions there's a band, which is sameness. The symbolic function urges us to constantly differentiate what we do, what we say, and to avoid, fundamentally, this is really the fundamental law, to avoid to put, how can I say that? To put the same together with itself. And the ban of the ban in Lévi-Strauss is the prohibition of incest. You've all heard of that, right? The prohibition of incest. Lévi-Strauss says it is a law that exists in all human communities, all societies, be they primitive or civilized, etc. The ban on incest, the incest prohibition, which means that the same cannot go with the same. Okay? So, Lévi-Strauss says it is not something normative, it is a description of what we're doing and what we do with words, with sexual partners, and with goods. For Lévi-Strauss, the symbolic has three main domains of function, which are language, kinship, and economy. So we exchange words, we exchange partners, and we exchange goods. The rule of the rules is exchange. In each case, the same flies away in a certain sense from itself. Okay? So this is what Lévi-Strauss will study in the societies he intends to analyze. It means that what is the anthropologist doing if the rules are all arbitrary, if the only thing we can say is that the fundamental law is not the same with the same, but always exchange and difference? Okay, but then what is the anthropologist doing? Because he cannot explain. Okay, we stop considering the symbol as a locus of hermeneutics. You cannot read the symbolic because it's flat, because it's arbitrary. And in the introduction to the work of Marcel Mauss, so I'm sorry because we have so little time, I will just give you the pages. I don't have time to go through the text with you, unfortunately. So I will give you the important pages and read the passages myself very quickly. On page 12, it says, a symbolic system can only be collective, horizontal. So the new interpretation of the symbolic will not be hermeneutical in the classical sense, like you interpret the deep meaning of a symbol, its hidden secret. You remember we talked about the secret yesterday. Lévi-Strauss says there's nothing behind the symbolic. We have to develop a mode of reading which is horizontal, which remains at the level of the contract itself, that is, of the collective. Of course, this immediately, the new method Lévi-Strauss is trying to discover is immediately at odds with an immense problem that he encounters, which is the problem of the religious. Immediately, when he started to define structuralism, and a structure is precisely this arbitrary rule, immediately other anthropologists told him, but what is your stupid definition of the symbolic? As you know, all societies have religious practices. Religious practices are made of symbols, so you cannot reduce the religious to this arbitrary horizontal convention. What do you do with God? What do you do with the symbolic function of God? In primitive societies, of course, but also in our societies. What do you do with that? And this is when, Lévi-Strauss has this magnificent response to that question in that book, in the introduction to the work of Marcel Mauss, which is, in fact, this introduction is an answer to the problem of the religious. So let me tell you a few words about Marcel Mauss. Marcel Mauss is linked to Durkheim, the French sociologist. He's his nephew, and he has two main books that you know, I'm sure, which is Essay on the Gift. So it's about economy, and Derrida has written a lot about that. And the other one is a general theory on magic. Okay? And they are from, well, the 20s, and Lévi-Strauss writes in the 50s. In these books, Marcel Mauss already recognizes that the fundamental symbolic law in human societies is exchange, and particularly economic exchange, the gift. That in all societies there is the law of this exchange, which is that something is given and something is given back. But at the same time, Morse says that, and we'll go deeper into this in a moment, that in order to explain why people exchange words, goods, women, in order to understand that, we must suppose something like transcendent, magical, that precisely religion, in primitive societies in particular, are here to express and hide at the same time the secret that is at the basis of all exchanges. For example, the sorcerer in primitive societies is for Mauss the incarnation of the secret of exchange. So religion, analyzed by Morse, is the expression of something hidden, secret, and what is secret is the reason why we exchange. Okay? It is arbitrary, it is true, but at the same time, arbitrary can also mean, for us, secret, something that we cannot understand. And so this is something that is becoming very urgent for Lévi-Strauss. Can we, or can't we, flatten the arbitrary? Do we constitute it as a secret, as a new form of secret, in which case it becomes magical or religious? Or can we open it until it becomes totally transparent and horizontally legible? This is exactly what Lévi-Strauss will do himself in his book, The Introduction to the Work of Marcel Mauss. He will precisely deconstruct or even destroy the notion of the magic and of the religious. Structuralism appears then as a desacralization of the symbol. Which means that we have to read the law of exchange, I mean the rule of the rules, we have to read it horizontally without looking for anything beyond it, without looking for any religious secret beyond it. We have to read it just as Saussure, the linguist, reads language, that is purely as a combination of elements that have no meaning in themselves, but only in their gathering. Okay? We were talking about the system yesterday, like linking one point of the system to the other, finding a way of interpreting the symbolic in a perfectly horizontal and transparent way without ever referring to the transcendence of God. Okay? So this is, with structuralism, this is an immense revolution that is occurring in the field of social sciences, when we have to accept the arbitrary as it is, the arbitrariness as it is. We have to understand that what binds us together is perfectly ungrounded, that it is useless to try to find an explanation with something mystical or magical. That's what we have to do, is to try to understand how, if the rule is the same for all, that is for all societies, then at the same time, societies are all different. So we have to understand the only thing we can read in the symbolic is why its occurrences are each time different. So for example, the differences between primitive societies in South America and in Indonesia, etc. So the differences of cultures, and also the differences of culture in the West, etc. So we have to understand that the rule is the same for everyone, and at the same time, why there are cultural differences. And that's why in Levi-Strauss's book you have these comparisons between the different myths, between the different practices, between the different ways of organizing kinship, etc. This is a method, as he says, of variations. You compare things together and you make them vary. Okay, so this is the new method to interpret the symbolic function. So of course, what I would like to explain to you today is what in the end is the sacred becoming. What does Levi-Strauss do with that? Because with the religious, the sacred. And this is the answer I will give in the end of the lecture. This redefinition of the symbolic, I'm ending my first point here. This redefinition of the symbolic that appears essentially so in that book, the Introduction to Marcel Mauss, but also in Structural Anthropology, which, I'm sorry, of course we don't have time to read together, but which is a very fundamental book, Structural Anthropology, and you have a chapter in that book which is called The Effectiveness of Symbols. If you're interested, you can read this one. I think it is the most important in all the book. So, yes, he redefines the symbolic in these two books, mainly, Marcel Mauss and Structural Anthropology. And he says that, okay, so how can we define the symbolic function more specifically, more precisely? He says we have to define it as the power of human spirit to impose structural laws upon a formless material. So the power of human spirit to impose structural laws upon a formless material. That is the way in which culture appears, as I said, as a way to impose these arbitrary laws, structural laws, upon a formless material, which is nature. Right? So, for Levi-Strauss, that would be the fundamental characteristic of the human to project on nature a series of rules, laws, structures, Levi-Strauss will say, that again have no meaning in themselves, right? That are structured by exchange. And Levi-Strauss, very interestingly, calls this activity of imposing laws upon nature, he calls that the unconscious. He says the symbolic is both social and psychic. Social, because it's all the contracts. It's the rule of social life in all its dimensions. But it is also psychic. And it has this definition in the introduction to the work of Marcel Mauss on page 35. The unconscious would thus be the mediating term between self and others. So, the unconscious in Levi-Strauss is the origin of the law. Okay? That is the way in which, well, the origin of the act of imposing structures on nature, but also then the opening to the others. Because if the human spirit is imposing laws on nature, it is also what opens it to communication. Okay? What makes us able to communicate between us is that we all share the same unconscious, which is that we need structures, that we cannot be in the world without structuring it according to these rules of exchange. So then, for Levi-Strauss, the unconscious, structurally defined, is at the same time a series of structural laws of exchange, all based on the incest prohibition that, according to him, is absolutely universal. The universal, precisely structure of human mind, of the human mind, in spite of the differences, and the spreading of the same patterns. Okay, so that, for example, we all know what a mother is, a father is, even if each time in each society kinship is organized differently. Okay, so it will be a series of structuralism studies the symbolic function both as an organ of universalization, the origin of law, which is the same in all human communities, and the opening of this universality to differences, because each time the same patterns are organized differently in each culture. Okay? So do you have any question at that point? Because this was my first point, like the very brief redefinition of the symbolic. Is it clear? Yes. Okay. So I want, in my second point, move to what I was saying a moment ago, that is how how can we account for such a desacralization of the symbolic? You can notice that yesterday we started with something totally mysterious, full of meaning. We talked about the secret, we talked about the crystal of the pyramid, and now we're moving to something totally transparent, arbitrary, horizontal, that is only a kind of a series of laws, of constraints, of rules, with no secret, precisely. So how can we go deeper into that desacralization, in a certain sense, detranscendentalization of the symbol? So my second point is precisely the critique of Marcel Mauss. What is Lévi-Strauss saying exactly in that book? So this text was written when the publisher decided to publish a collection of the works of Mauss, and they asked Lévi-Strauss to write the introduction to it. So it's a strange introduction because on the one hand, he praises Mauss. He says Mauss is the father of structuralism, but at the same time, he develops this very strong critique of any form of transcendence of the symbol. And he uses that process, that introduction, to also himself, like Hegel, totally deconstruct the traditional ethnographic approach to primitive societies, saying no, the sacred and the religious are not as important as we think. So in this introduction, I think the most important part is part 3, which is the last one. This is precisely where Lévi-Strauss will discuss the problem of religion and of the sacred. But before that, in the beginning, like page 21, the critique is already set up because Lévi-Strauss says Mauss still thinks it possible to develop a sociological theory of symbolism, whereas it is obvious that what is needed is a symbolic origin of society. Very difficult sentence. Mauss thinks necessary to develop a sociological theory of symbolism. I think that, on the contrary, we have to define the symbolic origin of society. Okay? So the difference is that Mauss thinks that sociology is made to explain symbolism, that is how the symbolic function in a society, rather than Lévi-Strauss says no, because sociology itself depends on the symbolic. What we have to bring to light is the symbolic origin of the social. Not the social meaning of symbols, but the symbolic dimension of the social. So this looks very abstract in the beginning, but this very sentence, which announces the deconstruction of the religious, is very important because it dictates the whole program of the book. Like we're going to invert the process, and instead of explaining the symbols in a given community from the sociological point of view, we will, on the contrary, make the sociological itself appear as symbolic. So in a certain sense, right from the beginning, Lévi-Strauss announces that he will break the law of hermeneutic and stop introducing transcendence and secret into the symbolic. This leads Lévi-Strauss to read the essay on the gift, which is, as you know, the most famous essay by Marcel Mauss. As you know, in the essay on the gift, Mauss talks about reciprocity, and he says the symbolic law of exchange is characterized by the fact that where there is a gift, there must be a counter gift. Okay? Like the exchange is reciprocal. It is not one, well, it doesn't go in a single direction. It's an exchange. So he calls that the symbolic function. That is the exchange in a circle. All right, but it says at the same time, and I said a few words about that to start with, it says at the same time, and it appears on 45, 46 in the introduction, it says there must be something like a mysterious property which forces the gift to be given, to circulate, to be given and returned. And the essay on the gift is devoted to an Indonesian tribe, and in that tribe they have a word, according to Mauss, that designates this circularity between the gift and the counter gift, which is the how. So Marcel Mauss will analyze this word, which in the tribe he's working on means the secret power of exchange. And in the other tribe on which he's working, this word is the mana. Okay, so Marcel Mauss will work on these two words that designate in the tribes the secret power of exchange. He says there must be, again, a secret force which pushes the gift to circulate, to be given and returned. Because Marcel Mauss says magic comes from the fact that, in fact, the gift is not intentional. It's not our intention, like I give you something, you give something back to me. Marcel Mauss shows that in the tribes, the Indians interpret the circulation as a property of the thing itself. It's like a boomerang, he says. It is as if the thing wanted itself to be exchanged and returned, etc. Okay? It's a kind of mechanical law that is not at all intentional. Once again, we are in the arbitrary, so it's not my intention to give you anything. Okay? It is internal to the thing. This is how the primitives interpret the exchange. And this must be a secret. This thing that is contained, this property that is contained in the thing that wants to circulate is magical. And we will call it how or mana. And Mauss goes on, 49, Lévi-Strauss reminds us, how is the same word, what does that mean? It's the same word for buying, selling, lending, borrowing. It's a bizarre word. These are bizarre words that mean, in fact, the symbolic, that is buying, selling, lending, borrowing, like the circulation of exchange. the things Mose says want to come back. And this is precisely what Lévi-Strauss will deconstruct. He reproaches Mauss precisely to conceive of mana or how as a mysterious force or secret power. And he says, and this starts on page 57, on the contrary, we have to read these words as pure symbols, he says. Very bizarre, he says. No. These words that appear as very mysterious, etc., don't have a signified. They do not refer to anything. We have to read them as pure symbols. So, this is very strange. What does it mean by that? And here starts the most interesting passage of all the introduction, that is from 59 up to 63. He says, we have to understand that these words, like how or mana, are pure symbols, that is, they are linguistic values that do not refer to anything transcendent. What does that mean? And then he develops his own theory of language and exchange. He says, the symbolic starts with language. Language is the convention of all conventions, the rule of all rules. And he says that, 59, language can only have arisen all at once. He has this strange theory, according to which language did not appear gradually. It was given all at once. It was given to us all at once as it was. Okay? There's no gradual acquisition of language. When language appeared with its arbitrariness, he says it can be compared with a sheet of paper. Thought in it is in the front, and the sound the back. I quote, one cannot cut the front without cutting the back at the same time. Likewise in language, one can neither divide sound from thought, nor thought from sound. Okay, so it means that language was given to us all at once, with the equivalence between the signifiers and the signifieds. Okay? It's like a sheet of paper. You have on the back, you have on the front, you have the concepts, that is the signified, and on the back, the signifiers, that is the sound. The problem is that even if language has been given to us all at once, we still need to learn how to speak. And this is the problem of childhood. But he also says it is the problem of humanity in general, that even if language was given to us all at once, we never master our own language. Okay? Which means that, for example, a child has to learn how to speak, and even us, adults, we perhaps use half of the linguistic possibilities of our own language. So there's a discrepancy between the fact that we know how to speak and that we understand how that works, that we understand that we have to exchange and circulate words. There's a discrepancy between our understanding of the function of language and our mastery of our own language, which is always and definitely deficient. Okay? We are at the same time rich and poor. Okay? We have the rule, we know the rule, we know how to play the game, but at the same time we don't. Because we'll always be below the whole capacity of our own language, and of course also when we speak a foreign language. Okay? So Lévi-Strauss is talking about this discrepancy between the suddenness and fullness of language and the fact of being always behind. And he says, this explains why we exchange. There's nothing mysterious in the gift, in the exchange. It is precisely because we don't master the whole of our language that we speak. Because if we were able if we were aware of all the possibilities of our own language, if we knew how to say everything, then we wouldn't speak. We wouldn't need to speak. Okay? That would be precisely the divine. Okay? Because God doesn't even need to speak. Right? Because precisely if you understand the problem, right? If we were able to play, it's like the game of chess. If we were able to win each time and to know every possibility, then we wouldn't need to play. So Lévi-Strauss explains the law of exchange, and this is the symbolic, as this kind of race that we are caught in, which is like we are running after our own language, we are running after the plenitude that we cannot have. So reciprocity, for Lévi-Strauss, is nothing mysterious. The necessity to exchange has nothing to do with the magic, with this how or mana, and we'll come back to the status of these words in language, like pure symbols. What does that mean? But at the moment, what is important is that reciprocality is nothing sacred or mystical. It comes from the fact that, as Lacan will say, none of us is all. We are the not all. Le pas tout, as you know in French. We are just a part of a totality, and this is why we exchange. Okay? So the symbolic function expresses the fact that, paradoxical fact that we know the rule, we're absolutely able to play the game of exchange. But in linguistic, in economy, and in kinship, we are always running behind, we are always looking for the perfect circle, the perfect mastery that we will never get. Okay? And this is why we exchange. And this is why we have myths, we have religions, we have, this is the symbolic explanation of sociology. We create, after the fact, mystical explanation for a very banal phenomenon, which is that we are not all. That's we are just. Oh, excuse me. It will stop anyway. So instead of, you see the inversion, instead of saying, okay, we exchange because there's this secret power in the beginning that the thing wants to be exchanged and circulate, instead of saying that, Lévi-Strauss says, no. The mystical or the magical is an invention a posteriori. The first fact is that it is a structural lack, that Lacan will also analyze. It is a structural incompleteness that the symbolic function dooms us to both know how to play the game of life, the structural game of life, and at the same time dooms us to not be able to master it. But there's nothing mysterious in that. It's just human finitude, right? So then, what is the status of these words, like how, mana, etc.? And Lévi-Strauss says we have to consider them as pure symbols. So what does that mean? And this time we're going to turn to the text. So it's 59 up to 63. I will just pick up some passages. Okay, so on 59 it says, he repeats that language can only have arisen at once. So this is where he explains the sheet of paper, etc. And he says that on 60, in order to explain the discrepancy between, as I just said, the fact that we know how to play the game, but we never win each time, says that there's a discrepancy in human language between a limited number of signifieds and an almost infinite number of signifiers. I read 60. We could even say the process which enables us to choose from the entirety of the signifier and from the entirety of the signified those parts which present the most satisfying relations of mutual agreement. Okay, so when we speak, we try to link the signified and the signifiers. But he goes on that 62. There is always a non-equivalence or inadequation between the two. A non-fit and overspill which divine understanding alone can soak up. This generates a signifier surfeit relative to the signifieds to which it can be fitted. So, and I will explain, in man's effort to understand the world, he always disposes a surplus of signification. And it's a distribution of supplementary ration, it says. Okay? So, in order, and this is related to the fact that we know how to play the game, but we never win. That, according to Lévi-Strauss, that situation creates a very specific fact that we have too many words for too little signified. Okay? The signifieds are very limited, according to Lévi-Strauss. The concept, the meaning of things, are in fact not that extended. Okay? But because we don't master them anyway, even if they are not that extended, we create a kind of proliferation of signifiers. So for example, for one thing, we have 10 ways of saying it, or an infinite ways of saying it. And this explains art, this explains literature, this explains, okay? So you have, in fact, very little, very few concept or signifieds, but a proliferation of signifiers. And this is why we exchange all the time, because we're running after our own language, meaning that we're trying to say more and more and more and more, running after signification without ever really attaining it, yes?
I think you also, but I'm just curious that, I mean, the early rhetoricians, I mean, Isocrates, Cicero, they knew this within their sphere. I mean, they talked about this.
Yep.
They proposed strategies and solutions to this and accommodated the sacred. Is Lévi-Strauss taking that on, or is he thinking he's saying something different, or is he positioned in that way?
Okay, so I'm sorry, I mean, what happened?
Somebody really wants you.
Yeah,
Yes, check it, do check it. You
No,
never
but I
know.
don't know what it is. I have to
Take your
plunge
time.
It might be an emergency.
I'm sorry.
It's
I
okay, we
feel
need a
like
break anyway.
No one ever calls me.
Yeah,
You're interesting. You're
But anyway,
look, you find it, it's important. Someone's trying to get you.
I did it.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
But you know, and I can't find it in all my.
It must be there. We
I
can
share
it.
it. I share that.
So this is ridiculous. Okay. So who is it?
Do you want to get that?
No, I said no. It's no problem. Okay, I'm gonna switch it off.
For them it is.
Oh.
Sorry.
All right.
I
This
still
is getting
wanted that to
interesting.
be the person
Okay.
who's ringing.
We need a
No,
third
this is not
interruption.
this man who was trying to.
Oh, was it?
So,
Maybe it's not pertinent to your argument. but
yeah, it is
It
because
just really
as
occurred to me.
I just read, it says that the perfect adequation between the signified and the signifiers would be divine. It says only God, yeah, which divine understanding alone can soak up, which
Yeah.
means that only God could soak up the excess of signifiers. Okay? But of course, God does not exist for him. All right? This is a hypothesis which is like a kind of impossibility. All right? So now, you're right. What is the function of these words like how or mana then? That for Maus designate precisely the mystical, the divine, etc. Lévi-Strauss says, this is his theory, and this is the end of, I'm just finishing this and then we open the discussion. This is what happens on 63, 64, that in the system of symbols, 64, okay, I'm going to read this passage and then explain. In the system of symbols, which makes up any cosmology, it would be a zero symbolic value, that is, a sign marking the necessity of a supplementary symbolic content over and above that which the signified already contains, which can be any value at all, provided it is still part of the available reserve and is not already, as the phonologists say, a term in a set. Very bizarre. Which means that, and this is, and I'll finish on that, that for Lévi-Strauss, and this is what is fascinating in his theory, language itself expresses this inadequacy. That is, I told you that we're always behind our own language. We never can master the whole of language. And this creates this inadequacy between a limited number of signifieds and an almost infinite number of signifiers. So this is our limit. But Lévi-Strauss says it is not only our limit, it is also the limit of language itself. Language itself functions as an inadequacy. That is, language itself produces, always in all languages, Lévi-Strauss says, it produces an excess. It produces some signifiers, in excess, some zero value signifiers. Like how, mana, words that don't mean anything, pure excess. Okay? So in fact, the excess of signifiers that we produce, because we can't master the whole game, this excess is expressed by language itself, because in no language you will always find words that don't mean anything. Pure zero value. And this is precisely these words that were assigned to the sacred in previous anthropology, rather than for Lévi-Strauss, it is a perfect, these words are perfect zeros, like void, empty squares. How, mana, and it says in French, le truc, or in English, the gimmick, you know, these words that don't mean anything. Zero symbolic value. So I'll let you read these very important pages, like 63, 64, what he calls the floating signifiers that exist in all languages. We all have, in all languages, words that don't mean anything, that are just here to express the inadequacy of language with itself. Because in all language, you have this excess of signifiers over the limited number of signifiers. According to Lévi-Strauss, this is nothing sacred, it is a linguistic law. The equivalence in economy is luxury, is squandering, expenditure. You know what Bataille will analyze as the excess, expenditure. That the fact that we, in a certain sense, always have more than we need, and language itself expresses that. But this having more than we need is at the same time an expression of poverty and finitude. Okay? But it is not, for Lévi-Strauss, it can't be related to religion. Religion is just a post, after the fact explanation. You understand what I mean? Okay? So, yes. So now we can open the discussion and I can explain some. Was very. I think that was first. You were first. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe I'm a little bit confused. I was thinking the mastering of the game would be somehow a perfect representation of a perfect link between the signifier and the signified. Because what I was wondering is if the signifier somehow it's built upon intersubjective relations. Representing somehow or making a common representation on how we organize life, symbolically speaking. So it would be impossible to master a game because there's no game at all. It's just how we as a whole, as a community, try to express or organize our reality. And therefore, it would be a cultural or ideological game constantly struggling to build.
Yes, absolutely. So in that sense, you're right. There's no game. But for Lévi-Strauss, it's easier to compare it with the game because it's about the same kind of situation where you have a rule that doesn't have a meaning in itself, but that allows for exchange and in fact, in the game, you also have the same law, which is that there's always a limited number of rules and infinite possibilities of playing. You see? So it's just about the same.
Because the exchange would be the game itself in our communitary nature in order to organize our
no,
reality.
absolutely. Yeah. I think you were second.
Yeah. I'm wondering whether there's still not a mystery at stake
of course.
in Lévi-Strauss,
You're right.
even though you presented the argument very convincingly, because I think why does this lack in itself, that negativity in itself, why does that produce an activity, our running, our exchanging, our running after language? And of course the kind of word I need is a word like drive or a word like will, or something like that, because I mean, polemically speaking, this lack, our non-mastering language, that could also just make us completely silent, or create
but you're perfectly right.
Make us paralyzed, and then one could say, okay, but in that case we would die. But if that is the basic argument, then it's an argument of survival, and that's a much more primitive argument than the sophisticated. argument of language. So it is almost as if this excess of language contains in itself the drive to, move on.
Absolutely, and well, but this is exactly Lacan's response to Lévi-Strauss, because Lacan in the beginning is very close to that definition of the symbolic, and at the same time he says we can only explain this situation by referring to another definition of the unconscious that cannot be only like imposing laws on nature, but also, as you say, reflect and deepen this negativity. So that's why the symbolic by Lacan will both respect this horizontal reading, but also open it to a form of transcendence. Because you're right, there's something wrong in Lévi-Strauss's argument. Because we could say, and this is what has been said by Derrida, for example, that Lévi-Strauss just substitutes a mystery for another one. Of course. Yeah. So I'm moderating, so she was first.
I also hear that through the text that he actually affirms the sacred. This is what they can feel, because he basically says there is meaning.
Could you speak up? We can't hear you.
Yeah. So I say that I can actually see how he actually confirms that there is a sacred that exists. That he says that there is a sacred that exists because there is a meaning in life that no matter how much we try, we can't express it. And we can try to invent more words, we can go to art, we can go to rituals, we can go to, but there is actually something here that no matter how much we try, we can't express it. And basically human beings are engaged in the activity of trying to express what they are not able to put into words or form.
Yes.
And this is to say there is something mysterious.
Of course, but he does not deny that. He knows that societies have religions and practices, etc. But you remember what I said in the beginning, it's a matter of inverting the trend. Instead of saying, we are going to explain these religious practices using symbols, we will, on the contrary, show that religions and practices, etc., derive from the symbolic. Okay, so it's a matter of how you explain that. He knows, of course, the presence of the sacred in all societies. But is it because we have the sacred that we have symbols? Is the sacred the origin of the symbolic, as most tends to say? Or is it not, on the contrary, the symbolic that is the origin of the mystical? That this lack, this negativity, isn't this the reason why we create these mystical... You see, so he knows that there is this, of course, he knows that, but the problem is how you account for it.
And I think there is a break of something else here between, so it's not only religion that we can't express. Through his argument or theory, we can break the sacred as religion, and we can, for example, look at trauma, right? And we cannot express trauma. It has nothing to do with religion. It's just this meaning that cannot be expressed.
Yes, absolutely.
And therefore his argument goes way beyond the question of religion.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree. And there's a chapter in structural anthropology where he talks about the trauma in the effectiveness of the symbol.
Thank you for your lecture. I have a question. You mentioned at some point about the emptiness of the symbol, especially when, for example, we create words that do not have any meaning. But I remember studying phonetics, and there is a concept in studying phonetics.
Okay, yes.
And there is a concept that it's phonetic symbolism. So, for example, when you say a word, fifi, or fofo, the e evokes something thin, for example, and fofo would be something thick, for example. No? So in this kind of evocation that maybe perhaps could be a kind of symbolism. So I wonder, and especially if we think in poetry, for example, if you read Malabou, as you mentioned yesterday, when there is a complete kind of deconstruction of grammar and language, and when even there is no any, it's only sounds, no? But those sounds, in a way, can express and maybe to create a kind of a symbol. So I was wondering what's your opinion on that? Thank you.
Yeah, it's totally true. And you know, there's someone who really talks about that very well, who's Deleuze, in Logic of Sense. There's a chapter on the floating signifiers, and he refers to Lévi-Strauss and the empty square. And he says this is the origin of poetry. This is where he talks about Lewis Carroll and all these words, you know, that don't mean anything. I forgot where.
No, yeah, Alice in Wonderland.
Yes, Alice in Wonderland. But what are these words that Deleuze is talking about that don't mean anything? But anyway, if in fact at the heart of Logic of Sense, you have all this theory of the floating signifiers as being the origin. You're right, of poetry. Yes, of course. Yeah. I think you were first.
Yeah, just to take up that point about the sacred and trauma at the back. It's in the clinic, the Lacanian clinic, to work on the real, you work on the symbolic, because the real is an effect of the symbolic. So to change the real for any particular subject, you always have to go to the symbolic and work on the symbolic, which really fits with what you're talking
anyway,
about.
the simple fact of what we're talking about, like we're receiving the role at birth, is traumatic per se. Like to come into that world means to be, in a certain sense, subdued. So this is already traumatic. Yeah.
Can I just add one other thing? For years and years and years, people say the gift is not possible because of potlatch. Coming out of this tradition that you've covered, but in the interdisciplinary world that I inhabit, people would say the gift is not possible because potlatch, it's always an attempt to shame the other into some sort of reciprocation. But recently, in relation to austerity and debt, the Italian philosopher, my mind's blanking on his name, even the pronunciation, I just can't think of the name.
Lazzarato?
Yeah, Lazzarato. Has started to take up this question of the gift again. And I just wonder, you know, if you've got any kind of take on this. The gift has become gift economy has become extremely important again. You hear it all the time in response to austerity and those questions. And I just wonder whether, you know, the part maudite in Bataille and how that's taken up by Derrida in the general economy and why this has been so important to artists. You know, artists often think about what they're doing is dealing with the imperceptible, going to a certain limit to deal with the imperceptible, and they become indiscernible subjects to produce the unnameable. And whether that's that excess.
But all the different approaches to the gift that all originate in Moses, they say. All these massive amount of discussion about that. Yes. In fact, always refer to the same problem, that is that something is functioning and is dysfunctioning at the same time. Yeah. Exactly like language, as we said. We know the rule, but we never win. In fact, it's the same thing with the gift. And they're all saying this, that, okay, the rule is reciprocity, and at the same time there's no reciprocity. It's exactly the same problem, that the same rule expresses success and failure at the same time. So depending on which side you are, you will insist upon the failure, and this is what Derrida does, for example, when he says there's no gift, there's no such thing as a gift. Or if, on the contrary, you insist upon the success, it's more like Lévi-Strauss, yes, circulation is possible. It depends on how you interpret, the inadequacy
So Lacan's response to that is that love is giving what you haven't got to somebody who doesn't want it.
Mhm. So yeah, we'll see Lacan tomorrow. Yeah, Lacan says anyway, nobody wants to give anything to anyone. So, but you, no, I'm sorry, I have to take your questions in order. So she was first. Yeah.
It is about the concept of mana.
Yeah.
So Moss, of course, talked about it in the essay of the gift, but it has been talked about by earlier anthropologists as well, like Tyler and Fraser. That was adopted by Freud in Totem and Taboo.
True.
On which he distinguished various classes of taboo. So I was just thinking that through Levi-Strauss's argument, can this theory completely fall flat? Where the argument about taboo, on which Freud later built based on psychoanalytic theories, if there is no mana, if there is no mysterious power, then how can that be true?
Well, this is very interesting. This is a very interesting question. I mean, but if you look at Freud, in fact, if I remember well what he says in Totem and Taboo, there's no real secret in all that. I mean, the taboo in Freud plays the same role as incest in Levi-Strauss. The taboo as a more structural role than just a religious one. Freud does not explain what a taboo is. It is just don't touch it. You remember the ban on touching. So the taboo is something that creates that feeling of uncanniness, etc., because you can't touch it. But you know what Levi-Strauss says is more or less the same thing. Like the same cannot go with the same. So the taboo is here to make manifest the necessity to circulate. So it seems to me that we can have a totally structuralist reading of Freud. For Freud, religion is just, I mean, you can deconstruct it very easily. So, but it's very interesting, yeah.
And there's one more thing. It is about the psychic unity of humankind that you talked about, that Levi-Strauss said that symbolic is divided into two, social and psychic.
Yes.
So this was, I think, if I remember it correctly, Adolphe Bastian's concept, which was adopted by Tyler, his disciple later on. And so it is kind of interesting that how these anthropological theories, in which we can find certain aspects that are being adopted, and from the same theorists, certain aspects which have been not really looked into. So Levi-Strauss adopted psychic unity, but yes, of course, the mana or the mysterious power was kind of
evacuated.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, for sure. What he brought into all this is a, as we said, a kind of desacralization. But there's a real break here. But you're right. Regarding categories that had been approached already and that were central in other theories. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. So you.
I wonder when you kind of throw out this offhand remark that there's something really wrong with Levi-Strauss. I want to probe this a little bit. What to me always seemed tremendously, insuperably wrong with Levi-Strauss, just on the level of the form of his argument, is the contrast that he makes repeatedly between signified and signifier. The quantity of signified and the quantity of signifier. As if these were numerical quantities. As if there was a position from within anybody who read even a page of Saussure, one could ever frame an argument in those terms. He himself evokes this Saussurean image of the sheet of paper.
Yeah.
He himself endlessly talks about complementarity. He relies on the fact that I am not going. If I understand his critique of Mauss, what he is saying is that he's a reductionist. He wants to reduce religion to sociology.
True.
All of these are reductionist arguments. All reductionist arguments out of the window, my friends, because you need to start with the idea of the total fact of the system and the symbolic. The only variables we'll talk about is nature culture as immanent to the symbolic systems. Those are the transitions. It's not from psychology to sociology, from sociology to psychology. All of that is reductionist nonsense talk, essentially. So what I don't understand is that how he can have, on the one hand, these very powerful affirmations of complementarity, and then
But it is what is interesting.
and then talk about as if we could, because to talk about, to even verbally to contrast signifier and signify, talk about quantity discrepancies, mana is making up for the surfeit or lack, play all these games with us. It is as if there are two, like he has a bicameral brain, and he is running two streams of argument. And they do not really hear each other very well.
But when you talk about quantity, it's a metaphor.
Exactly.
No, so it's not saying, we have a determinate.
Right. So if that is indeed a metaphor, then we're dealing with a metaphor of Saussure rather than Saussure.
But this is precisely the problem, is that we need metaphors. This is precisely the problem, that we need metaphors.
So that he is not really doing Saussure.
It means that if we need metaphors, it's because there is an inadequacy. If there were a perfect adequacy between the signifiers and the signifiers, we wouldn't need to use metaphors. And a metaphor is a floating thing.
But can we even speak about adequacy if they're complementary? Is there a position?
Complementary is the rule of the rules. I mean, when I speak, you immediately understand that I'm articulating two elements, which is the signifier and the signifier.
Right.
So the complementarity is, if you don't, somebody who loses this complementarity becomes aphasic, okay? So it's the rule of the rule. But you can affirm the complementarity, without which no language is possible, and at the same time, notice that this complementarity does not prevent failures, the success he's talking about, like the fact that we use metaphors, we use images, we try to say, oh, what do I want to say? Let me tell it differently. Let me say it differently. Okay, I'm going to explain it to you differently. You know, this is not contradictory with the complementarity.
Right. No, of course not. But he's talking as if the world has signified long before we began to signify. How can he say that and remain a structuralist?
Because otherwise, then what do you say? Would you say, okay, people once gathered in the forest and they start naming things one after the other?
No, I think...
Would you be more satisfied with that?
My sense is that I'm just rehearsing essentially Derrida's critique, where he says that if you have differential relations, that there is no plenitude at the origin. And this is what I'm objecting to.
Okay.
So I'm just giving you a version of Derrida's objection.
No, you're totally right.
All Lacan's position that lets them talk about signifier, and signified would be an array of effects, and floating master signifier, name of the father will be versions of
I'm trying to advocate for Lévi-Strauss because...
and I'm just acting out years of being angry while reading this text.
First, but I can't explain to you right now.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I'll stop.
Derrida is very unfair with Lévi-Strauss, but this okay. For the fact that language was given to us at once, what does that mean? It means that, for example, look at a child who starts speaking. This is what Lévi-Strauss means. The child understands immediately what language is. I mean, he understands how that works. And at the same time, he doesn't have the totality of it immediately. This is this discrepancy of something that we all share that is given to us. This is the gift. Language is given to us, and at the same time, it takes years for us to know how to speak. And even when we die, we won't have been able to master even the half of it. You know, this is this contrast, and Lévi-Strauss wants to break with the vision of language according to which people would have gathered one day out of the blue and say, okay, we're going to call that a table because this is absurd.
Rousseau already broke with that vision of language. I mean, Rousseau has already done it.
Yes.
It's already been done. I mean, Saussure had done it.
But Rousseau believes that one day we will be able to use only the proper sense of language. That one day we will. He says that the world is becoming more and more prosaic, that we're losing the metaphors. He's nostalgic about that. Rather than Lévi-Strauss, what he says, no, don't worry. Even if we are becoming more and more scientific, there will always be this excess of. No, it's interesting what he says.
I see it the other way around. It's Lévi-Strauss who says that there's a decline in structure at the end of Tropicientos. He talks about entropy and declining structures, and that they're no longer effective and ultimately will go to the inanimate. He's the apocalyptic one. But I don't hear that in Rousseau. This sense of nostalgia and decline. I think
it is true that Lévi-Strauss can be a bit apocalyptic. I agree with you. But
thank you.
I think his theory is extremely powerful. That you cannot just say, oh, this is kind of nostalgia, because it's, for me, even if you can read it differently, I understand that, and I have myself this contradictory reading. He's a great thinker of finitude and failure, and Lévi-Strauss is not at all this kind of powerful scientist who, no, he can have some.
The talking cure. I mean, how would you think that kind of symptomology where you just can't find the words, and how the symptoms do dissolve when you find the words? So there's something about, finding the right words in this relationship between having it all but not having the words.
Yeah, and so this is true that he says that science is a discourse that tries to put the right words on the right signified. Okay? So he says this is the difference between science and poetry, that, for example, even if we use floating signifiers like the quarks, in this example of physics, the quark becomes rational signifier for a signifier. In science we name things in order to fix a certain meaning. But in Lévi-Strauss, language is not only science, it's also, as you say, it's the talking cure, it's poetry, I think it's very rich. But anyway, was there another question? No.
Just jouissance. I know you're coming to Lacan tomorrow, but Lacan
You're frightening
starts
me because I'm not.
No, I don't want to frighten you,
Real
because
Lacanian.
whenever I mention jouissance, I know you.
Don't count on me.
No, but I just wonder whether mana, jouissance is another name for mana. This is just, I don't know. I'm just.
No, but it's true that I was answering you. What's your name already? Yeah,
Christina.
Christina. I'm trying to remember your name, so it's hard. As you were saying, Christina, there's a negativity that Lévi-Strauss, for sure, and in that case, I agree with your critique that there's a trend in Lévi-Strauss which is to flatten the negativity, to recognize it, and at the same time to exclude it. It's both. And so Lacan will try to integrate this negativity back into the symbolic and try to address the critique you're addressing already. This is true. But me, personally, I can't help finding Lacan sometimes it's too mystical for me. I prefer the flat. I'm more comfortable with someone who tells me there's no mystery,
But there is a mystery. The efficacy of the symbol, l'efficacité symbolique, that is his mana. He reenacts what he is analyzing.
Okay, but it is as if you told me, and this is Wittgenstein, we should read on that point. When Wittgenstein says, there is no reason why the rule of the chess game is what it is. Okay? All right? You can call that a mana. He says the only reason of this rule of the chess game is that it is not the checkers game. The only reason for a rule of a game is that it is different from this other. Okay? You can call that a hyper mana. Who made the rules of the chess game? Okay. You can call that a hyper secret because no one will ever be able to explain that to you. It's as mystical as God the Father. And at the same time, you can also say there's absolutely no secret. It is perfectly arbitrary. It works. And so, let's take it as it is. It's totally flat, and there's no, trying to interpret the rule would be totally absurd. So, you can see it that way as well.
But I think on the efficacy of the symbols, I think Freud has a well-formed explanation why certain reinterpretations of the symptom have effects that are curative and some perpetuate the symptoms, like transference, remembering, and working through. Levi-Strauss does not have that.
Yeah, no.
He doesn't have that. So it's not simply, I think there is a well-formed answer to the question of symbolic efficacy, and there is a confused one, and Levi-Strauss is
confused.
confused.
Will ring at that point, but let me just tell you, are you more satisfied with the explanation that God has been eaten by his sons?
No, I'm satisfied with Freud's explanation.
Because me, personally, I prefer Levi-Strauss.
But it's
come
in a
on,
circle.
Freud is totally delirious, you know that.
But
at some point, some moments.
Sure,
only.
and so is Levi-Strauss.
Well, so yeah, tomorrow, just a last word. We will do more the names of the father than the Polaroid letter because it goes so fast.